What is the real minimum requirement? What is the real minimum requirement for Diablo 4? Welcome to Respawn PC, I'm Dunk, let's dive in. A quick reminder that in the last video, we've tried the minimum requirement and the recommended requirement, which is now the medium requirement. And the minimum requirement can play at 60 FPS. In this video, I'm going to try to go below the minimum requirement to see what is the real minimum requirement. And you will notice quickly that the 500 series of the NVIDIA GTX 500 because of the driver date. Same go for the AMD side of things. So the ATI HD 6770 that I have on hand, the driver is expired. The lower we can go is the 600 series of NVIDIA and an HD 7000 series, and won't let you launch the game. But the 4 gigabits under the minimum requirement will still launch with a warning. Then there's the CPU warning. If you go under 3 GHz, Blizzard tell you that don't say we didn't warn you. And my first attempt was with an Intel quad-core Q8200, a GTX 660 and 4GB of memory, everything at 720p low, just to try out. The graphic card I know can take it, but at the CPU I don't know. And as you can see, the CPU is getting pegged at 100% all the time. So does the RAM. I've tried to limit the FPS by putting a maximum of 30, and even there I wasn't even reaching 30 FPS. So it seems that CPU is really too low to be the minimum requirement. But let's try with a lower resolution. Now we reach time to time 30 FPS-ish. CPU peg at most of the time at 100%, but that is not the minimum requirement. Minimum requirement should reach at 720p low 30 FPS, continuously and stable. And right now the density of daemon is quite low. Then I jump on i7-920, which is 4-core 8-thread with the GTX 660 with different memory configuration and different resolution to see what was the frame rate and try to gauge what was the minimum memory to play Diablo 4. And regardless of the memory configuration, 4GB or 24GB, 720p it was over 60 FPS and 1080p was between 35 and 45 FPS. And we can see comfortably that the minimum requirement can go down to the i7-920 and 4GB of memory with the GTX 660. But now let's see if we can go lower CPU and lower graphic card. Let's start off with a lower graphic card. Still on the i7-920 and 24GB of memory. Just to try out the graphic card, it's a HD 7770 with 1GB of VRAM. And as you can see, we were able to play quite easily. We reach a peak of 44 FPS and the average is straight 30 FPS. And the GPU utilization is in the i90, 98, 99, sometimes hitting 100%. So I think we have a winner for the GPU. Now let's check out other CPU to see if we can reach a CPU in the 90s, and we're going to have the perfect minimum requirement. Since we've found our winner graphic cards, let's try change the CPU. This one we jump a generation, but instead of i5 2500 is the i3 2100, and I've skipped the 4 gigabit test because it was a stuttery mess. I wasn't even able to record the footage, so I jumped right away to 8 GB to do my test. And at 720p low, I was on a stable 27 to 29 FPS, having the GPU usage in the low 80s and the CPU in the 70s. I know I can go lower for the CPU. Let's see what 16GB of RAM will do to this i3. Now with 16GB with this i3 2100 quad-core at 720p low, we're reaching just over 30 FPS-ish. So I say that's a win. The minimum CPU is definitely not the i5 2500. You can see sometimes the CPU pegging at 100% when changing some area. Let's go back to a first gen of Intel CPU and see how it fares. The CPU I went from the first gen of Intel is the i5 650, another quad-core, and I had a stuttery mess at 4GB. Even at 8GB of memory I had a stuttery. It was quite stuttery, even though I had a higher FPS in the mid-30, was far from stable. The stuttering was making it really hard to play. So I decided to try at 16GB, and that game was finally stable. We're using about 10GB of memory. The CPU and the GPU usage was on the 90, 80. It was finally playable with that CPU. And also we're not at 30 FPS. We're in the high 30, low 40, but we're higher than the minimum 8GB requirement. I want to go lower. So with the same setup, but 12GB of memory instead of a 16, and we've reached what I can say that is the perfect minimum requirement-ish, can say. We still had 8 gig of memory, but we are close to the 30 FPS, CPU and GPU on the 90s and higher. I think we have a winner again, since now we know about where the Intel CPU is. Let's check the equivalent for the AMD side of things. For the AMD side of things, it was the Phenom 2 X6 1045T with the HD 7770 and 8 gig of memory. I've tried 4 gigabytes, but it was a stuttery mess. Even at 8 gigabyte was a stuttery mess-ish. I had to lock the FPS at 30 to gain some stability, and it was playable. Not exactly 30 FPS, it was in the 25 to 28, but I would say it's quite acceptable. CPU and GPU was on the high end of usage. So we got our minimum requirement for Intel, or minimum requirement for AMD, minimum requirement for the AMD ATI graphic card, the NVIDIA side of things, my GT 640 that I was going to test just died on me on the test bench, and I wasn't able to put my hand on another 600 series graphic card. So not sure yet for the 600 series which NVIDIA is the lowest you can go. I'll try to get another card and come back later with the results. Keep in mind, I don't have every CPU and GPU available on the market, or not available on the market either. My testing was with what I have available on hand, but I can confidently say that the minimum requirement that Blizzard said for the Diablo 4 can be even lower. So if you're wondering if your Office PC with a low spec can run Diablo 4, you have a better idea now. Thanks to have come watching. See you next time.